Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I just thought you guys were giving me air. My name is Shay Akiwowo, and I am super excited to be here with friends, fellow disruptors, imaginative technologists, and colleagues and comrades who are up for disrupting the space. And that's what we're going to do today. I first want to do some thank yous. First, I want to thank the Glitch team that are here. This is our first international event, particularly post-pandemic, and we're in the heart of EU, so thanks for letting us back in. Sorry about Brexit. But I also want to say thank you to you guys for being part of this journey. This is a huge milestone for Glitch's history, but also for CPDP's history. The first ever all-black women panel at CPDP, so thank you for being part of this milestone in history. I'm loving the energy. Yes to the applause, more of that. You're soothing my Leo ego. And I want to say thank you to the panelists because you've come to cold, grey Brussels. And I'm sorry, actually, you live here, so we're dissing your hometown. And yours, some of yours as well, sorry. But thank you very much for joining and being a part of this conversation and for wanting to provoke the policy thinking and frameworks that actually are restricting a lot of our work. So I actually hope this is going to be liberating for all of us, and as well as you guys that get to see all of this. So who am I? Who's been making you do rounds of applause and greet me? I'm Shay Akiwowo. I'm the founder and CEO of a small but mighty organization called Glitch. And I'm a recovering politician for my sins. I sit on the boards of a couple of tech companies, including TikTok's Trust and Safety, and I'm the author of a book called How to Stay Safe Online. But my role isn't to be a panelist, it's to be able to moderate this conversation and to provoke all of you guys to think about how can you talk about governance if there is systemic exclusion of black women in the conversation. I am joined by friends, as I said, Matale Nkunde, we have Nima Elmi, and we have Asha Allen. And I just want to start with some context setting about this panel. We already know that black women are 84% more likely to face online abuse than white women. And we also know there's a massive lack of allyship and understanding around racial literacy and understanding around the misogyny that black women face. And we understand that we are also underrepresented in the rooms and conversations around research and around policy making, and even how research conversations are happening. There is a very unequal framework. So Glitch was seeing this, was very much feeling this in 2020, 2021. And so we began asking ourselves, what are the future trends? What do we need to be anticipating? What's going to be coming up? And yes, there are things around synthetic media and deepfakes, which is why we are here. There is also things around image-based abuse, video-based abuse, and for Glitch, we very much saw the viral trend of using or discussing or playing and sharing of police violence, of George Floyd's murder, of racial injustice. We were seeing how that was being shared in terms of empowerment, but actually was in the lack of consent of black communities. So we were seeing all of these trends on top of the notification tools that we've had lots of conversations over the last few days. And so we were asking ourselves at Glitch, how are we going to stay disruptive? How are we going to stay systemic? We don't want to play the whack-a-mole game of, oh, we're telling you off about Andrew Tate this year, and then we're telling you off about Trump next year, and we're telling you off about something else. How do we make sure we're staying systemic? How do we make sure that we're staying within frameworks and within policy? And so we're here today having achieved a huge milestone as a small organization by changing the social media regulatory bill, the Online Safety Act, to include women and girls. And that's the first of its kind. Oh, thank you. And that's the first of its kind to be regulating social media companies, but to have a risk assessment-based approach to intersectional gendered harms. We are also here today because deepfakes and synthetic media is on the rise, but yet we're not seeing black women in the conversation. Our huge concern is that we're going to repeat the same 8 years of convincing you and convincing power holders and decision makers that gender-based violence is a thing. This disproportionately impacts black women. We want to cut through and say, we already know that, so what does this mean for deepfakes? And this is setting the conversation that I am super, super, super excited about. So I am going to stop there with asking you guys to participate in this conversation with intention, by being intentional around listening, around unlearning, and sitting with discomfort, because I know these amazing women, they will challenge and provoke you. And so I ask you to sit with that discomfort. And I encourage you to use social media or our online space to put your statements and your positions and your rebuttals there, so that in the Q&A, we are actually hearing questions from the audience. Josh Rivers will not feel any type of way to do a Kanye moment and take the mic back if in the 50-minute Q&A at the end, we are hearing statements rather than questions. And obviously, we don't want anything inappropriate, like asking black women, how do we get more black women into the space? Because we are not here as DEI experts, we are here as tech experts, right? Great. And if you want to do all of that, you can do that with tagging @glitchuk_ with #DeepfakesDilemma. So thank you again, Asha. Thank you again, Matala, and thank you again, Nima. Let's get started with, tell me a story about what brings you here into the tech justice and liberation space.
That's a good question. And I should preface, we've known each other a long time, so you know how long I've been in this space, which is probably showing my age. I would actually ask if you on the panel or anyone in the audience remembers the End Father's Day hashtag. Do you remember? Do any of you remember what this was? This was back in 2013, 2014. And there were these, the only other way to describe it were, neo-Nazis, far-right activists who impersonated African-American women, used African-American vernacular English, and were using the hashtag End Father's Day to spread stereotypes and to spread discord between the feminist movement, right? And it was black feminist scholars and journalists who'd done the digging and revealed what was going on, right? And who remembers Me Too? You all remember Me Too, right? Hashtag was started by Tarana Burke, not by the famous actress who put it out there afterwards and who had to apologize afterwards for not crediting Tarana Burke with this. So I've been working on this for a long time, having seen in those, I don't even want to call them the early days, because I remember MySpace in 2001, and that's the early days. I've been working on this since then and seeing how it was black feminist analysis, it was technologists, it was black women journalists who were raising the alarm on these issues way back then. This is now 10 years ago. It feels a lot sooner than that, but 10 years ago. And so seeing how online gender-based violence was being perpetuated and proliferated is what brought me into this space. But I had just this fundamental question on why is it when we have technological advances, one of the first things that happens in terms of how it's abused is directed at women, and then disproportionately directed at minoritized women and racialized groups. It's one of the first things that's happening. And we're seeing it with deepfakes too. I think a lot of people think about deepfakes in the context of, say, disinformation and the spread of this content. But if you look at, say, gendered disinformation and how that's perpetuated, is incredibly embedded in misogyny, in racism, and again, disproportionately impacting black politically engaged women. So I think you have to even look at how these issues start, and then you actually see you need a black feminist analysis to even understand where some of these root causes are. So I will stop there in terms of how I got into the field, and we can explore further in terms of the implications of what that means.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Asha. Thank you for joining our panel. Nima, you have a very interesting story of how you got into the tech justice and liberation space. Would you mind sharing a short story of what brought you here and to give us a little bit of flavor about who you are and what you're up to?
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here and see so many faces for such an important conversation. So I am a recovering lawyer. So I started my career a very long time ago as a lawyer, understanding the basis of the justice system, and then transitioned into working in government in East Africa and understanding how significant the gaps are, and then layered on an understanding of technology, where I led a global team at the World Economic Forum which was really looking at the digital divide in the understanding between public sector, i.e. the governance of emerging technologies, and innovators and private sector who are at the forefront of emerging technologies. And understanding, after working with 70 plus governments, just how little public sector understood about industry and the evolution of technology, I was particularly shocked at how wide that gap was in emerging markets, particularly in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and part of ASEAN. And then I transitioned from the World Economic Forum into industry, working and leading Bumble's public policy team for a few years. And there is really where I was able to focus as a platform that was, female-founded, female-led, on really how do we make the internet safer for women? And so there's a nice nexus there with law, with understanding marginalized communities, and understanding gender discrimination. And a lot of that work was focused around how do we grapple with nefarious innovation? In AI, we're talking about deepfakes, nudification tools. More broadly, we're talking about toxicity. And the work of the Africa Dialogues is bringing all of that together. Essentially, really understanding how do we ensure that the digital revolution doesn't leave anybody behind? And by anybody, I mean marginalized communities in Africa, but also gender-focused marginalized communities in emerging markets, particularly in Africa. And so I'm excited to be here and be in this conversation and really unpack some of the very broad concepts that are put out there about, deep fakes and authenticity online, and really understand actually what are the layers when you really grapple with, are there the governance structures in place? Are they robust enough? And how do we ensure that representation is authentic? So I'm excited for the conversation.
Yes to that. Matale, we have had the fun journey. Me and Matale sit on Trust and Safety, TikTok Trust and Safety Council. They didn't know that we knew of each other. And by the end of our trip in Mexico, boy, did they know that we knew of each other. But our work intersects so much, and we, Glitch and AI for the People, authored a report for the United Nations last year around the data itself. Could you talk to what got you into this tech justice liberation work from that data technical perspective?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all of you. I would say very quickly, my personal origin story around the manipulation of data goes back to the 1990s, and I don't know if people remember the Rodney King tape, which was a videotape of a black man being brutally attacked by officers at the LAPD. This video was real, the attack was real, but when we looked at the way that that case ultimately went to trial, it was the story about the tape that meant that those police officers got off. So it was very clear to me very early on that it's not just that the images have to be real, what stories are being told about those images. And that really embedded the work that Glitch and AI for the People eventually started to do with the UN almost 20 years later. And the way that it intersected was deepfakes were invented in 2017. And at AI for the People, we looked at a report that said that there were 1,000 videos in 2018. And we were like, oh my God, 1,000 videos, how many of those are going to impact women? And we found out then that one of the most famous tapes was one of Scarlett Johansson. This is back in 2018. And she had written a really strongly worded letter to this very small app that had misrepresented her as being an adult film actress. And so an adult, not a film, anyway, you get what I'm saying. She was acting with no clothes on. I don't know how to say that politely. And we decided that we were going to draft some model language and introduce it to the Congressional Caucus of Black Women and Girls, which reports into the US House of Representatives, which we did. They took up that legislation, and in 2019, we were able to enter the Deepfakes Accountability Act that really called for impact assessment. And of course, this is the United States, so the act didn't get anywhere, but what we were then able to do was to show that this should be a legislative priority. And from there, we were contacted by the UN to help them think through these issues, which we obviously thought was fake email, because we were like, why would the UN contact us? But they did, and that's how we got to the report.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. I think often in this space you can see the kind of final product, but actually it's in the organizing, it's in the foundational work, it's in the relationships, it's in the mobilizing that we make change. Like it's in that. So thank you for sharing that. And actually this ties into the first question that I'm going to kick over to you, Asha, around digital rights. So Asha, your kind of bio, your journey after the stories that you shared involved a significant amount of time at European Women's Lobby, which is where we met, which was around getting the community at large to understand their digital rights, but also get the digital rights scene to see that that gender and race and racial equality rights were also something they had to adhere to. So you were kind of stuck in the middle of having to tell both camps you've got huge gaps in your understanding. How have you found that now at CDT, Center for Democracy and Technology, and what are the digital rights implications of deepfake technology?
Yeah, I'd say we've come a long way already since we first met way back when, there was a need for a conversation to kind of bring an intersectional perspective into a lot of rights movements, right? I think it's fair to say that the digital rights movement was very much influenced by the privacy movement in those kind of early days. And now, I mean, you can see from the sessions here at CPDP, you've got more panels on things about intersectional harms and gender than you had before. And I'd say same thing about the women's rights movement, right? We were so embedded in the more, let's say, quote unquote, traditional fights that we had around gender-based violence more broadly, that bringing in that what is the digital dimension to this? What is tech-facilitated gender-based violence? And those kind of early conversations were challenging, but also very encouraging to have. And so in terms of where we are now, so for those who don't know, the Center for Democracy and Technology Europe office, we're a not-for-profit organization, and we advocate for the upholding of international human rights standards in EU tech policy. And so we're very much bedded in the EU legislative scene, so that's where I'll come from as an EU policy expert and legal analysis. And so I think there's two ways to look at this when you think about the implications, right? There's the implication for our rights of this technology itself, and then there's the implications of what happens when regulators decide that there's a kind of buzz thing that they want to regulate on, and then they speed ahead to regulate on it. And that means that that regulation is often devoid of the very voices who need the most protection when it comes to these things. And I think you can see that. What the EU has done in terms of legal frameworks, I mean, there's been progress. There was a panel before ours, and it talked a lot about the directive on violence against women and domestic violence.
Which you played a huge part of, and please, round of applause to Asha around.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming. It was a long time coming. But that directive, it criminalizes, I think, 7 different forms of GBV, and 4 of them are cyber crimes, right? So that's telling you something about how far that we've come. So that directive, I want to give credit where credit is due, because it actually talks about intersecting discrimination and disproportionate harms and the need to take a victim's rights approach and addressing the fact that some are harmed in multiple different ways. It's the first time we have it in an EU text. We can be happy about this. And it actually criminalizes the act of creating and disseminating deepfake intimate images, right? This is a minimum standard, and this is something I want to clarify on, that EU member states can improve upon that framework that's there, because we have to admit the framework itself isn't perfect, but no law is, and a lot of power will come in how it's enforced. So that recognition, I think, is a step forward. And I have to tell you, when I left the UK 3 months after the Brexit vote, so I'm sorry too. It's been a long road since then to come there, going from we're only talking about cyber harassment to we've actually got a law now that puts that in place. What I will have to say, though, is that there are gaps, and I think this, again, touches upon some of the conversations that were had previously today, in that you have different legislation. So I've talked about the directive, but you also have the Digital Services Act, which requires very large online platforms to adopt due diligence measures to specifically address gender-based violence. It's one of the systemic risks that's in there, and that we fought very hard to get that specifically recognized in there too. And so there's kind of multiple ways that you can address this. But when we're talking about deepfakes, right, so we're talking about certain technologies. And we were having this conversation just yesterday about where the loophole is. And so far in the EU framework, there's nothing to address what happens when you have deployers of technology, so AI technologies, that's dedicated to creating deepfake, non-consensual, intimate images. That's missing, right? I will be honest, I originally assumed that the AI Act might be part of this 3-part package that would help address it, but it looks like these apps like Nudify or Clothoff, for example, are completely exempt from any responsibility in being a critical tool in disseminating what is now illegal content in the EU. The directive makes that content illegal. The DSA would recognize and require it to be removed as illegal, but then the onus is not there in terms of the apps that are being used to disseminate that content. So there are still holes in our framework that we have here in the EU that we need to address.
Thank you very much for bringing up the holes, and also where we need to celebrate the milestones as well, because this is a long journey in rectifying the mistakes of homogeneous exclusionary practices and policies. So this is a long, long, long journey. So it's important to celebrate the milestones of the gender directive. But like you said, there's holes, and the holes are around laws not matching up and making any sense. There's holes in actually providing governance and provision and safeguarding for women, like the fact that these apps exist, the fact that you can search Google Nudify and the first 10 pages are different types of apps that do this, or go into Google Play Store, this is available. There is a really easy win there. Stop making it easy to search for these things. Stop feeding the demands. This brings me into one of the holes that you were talking about earlier with me, Matale, around timelines and around the legal implications sometimes. Legal challenges to AI, even open AI, it is so time-bound. But you were sharing a story, an example of something that has been consistent for years. I'll stop there and stop teasing. Go ahead.
Yeah, it kind of goes down back to what I mentioned earlier around Scarlett Johansson being this particular figure that has been targeted since 2018. So in 2018, we were looking at non-consensual sexual acts and the idea that she was part of that. Fast forward to 2024, just this week, we find out that from a telephone call that she had, I wanted to say with Sam Bankman-Fried, but that is disinformation. I guess I'm getting all my scammers mixed up, but with Sam Altman, where he actually asked permission to use her voice, and then 6 months, 8 months later, her voice shows up as voicing ChatGPT-4, and that led us to think internally, well, was the call recorded? What jurisdiction was she in? Because I live in New York City. If somebody is recording my voice, that has to be known. Once that voice note was taken, it was then, without her permission again, then used to voice this. And I just want to shout out a friend and a comrade and somebody that I've known for a long time, and former MEP, Felix Rader, who's in the front here, who we were at a fellowship together at Harvard, and their project was looking at copyright and copyright directive, and how who owns what is another open legal question when it comes to AI, because is Scarlett Johansson the owner of that voice because she created the track, or are OpenAI the owner of now the synthesized voice for ChatGPT? And so I do want to say that certainly the thinking on this around the new legal imaginaries, not just the open gaps that we need, are also something that we need to think about, and really point out that when we were advocating in US Congress for Scarlett Johansson, we were advocating not only for somebody that we didn't know, but somebody that doesn't recognize our group. And I hate when we think about intersectional frameworks only benefiting a small group of people. Had we have been listened to then Charlotte Johansson and other much, much more vulnerable people who cannot afford to potentially sue OpenAI would have been protected also.
I was taking loads of notes there. There was so much to hold, but I don't want to keep interjecting into this really amazing flow. But the word that keeps coming up for me so far is the word consent. Like, there is just a huge issue around consent around someone's image, around someone's data, around consent around the research that you're doing on particular groups. Like, the justice to come back to using Black feminist approaches and texts to understand consent. And consent means seeing each other as full human beings. And so I'm actually going to come back to you again, Metella. You were talking about the importance of intersectionality as a framework, because it's a legal framework that also allows you to see what's happening offline. Do you even fully acknowledge that Black women, Black people at large, are humans to even have consent with?
Yeah, I think it's often forgotten that that particular legal theory was really, it was a labor dispute, a US labor dispute where Black women were not being promoted, and they were found that there was legislation for women to be promoted, and there was legislation through the Civil Rights Act for Black men to be promoted. And when this was challenged legally, the judge was just like, well, I don't know what to say. You're just not, like, sucks to be you. Thereby this framework raised. But then we're also having this conversation around the 50th anniversary of the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was a group of queer Black feminists in the United States. And if anybody reads that statement, it starts with, at the beginning, well, it starts by saying that we should deconstruct capitalism, which is not what this panel's about, but capitalism obviously drives the downloading of all of these apps that we're talking about, so it bears mention. But the very first line is that Black women are valuable. And in the work of AI for the People, we hold on to that idea and then extrapolate and say, and human beings are valuable. And if you attend many tech conferences, I actually was at one in December where Sam Altman was there, and it was so funny because the person before Sam was this robot who basically was like, we don't need humans anymore, I'm a robot and I'm here to do everything. And then there was Sam Bankman-Fried going, oh my God, that's so great. Then there was me going, maybe not. But this idea that human beings should be in the loop, and we should think about the inalienable rights of human beings, which is what I think the Center for Democracy and Technology and others do, then we would realize that it is just unethical to take somebody's biometric data, including their voice, be explicitly told, no, I do not want my data to be used in this way, and then use it anyway to see if you'll get away from that. Goes back to these deeply embedded misogynistic ideas that are driving what are commercial products. So you end up with companies making money off the, off the backs of the most vulnerable, even when we say no. Even when we say no, which is why we need laws. I know that there are gaps in the EU, but I am looking jealously from the United States, saying at least there are laws to have gaps in.
Fair point. And Nima, I want to bring you in here because in your previous role at Bumble, that app was all about consent. That was all about redressing the power dynamics to let women and marginalized genders being kind of in control of who they wanted to speak with, right? What would you say are the digital right implications of deepfake technology now? And where do you think the lack of understanding around consent and what you learned at your time in Bumble means for Black women on the continent of Africa?
There's so much to unpack there and so many things to react to. So I think there's a piece here around platform design. Ultimately, we are talking a lot about technologies, but ultimately they're developed by humans or overseen by humans. And these tech platforms are also managed by humans, as far as we understand. And so what does that mean? It means that the identity of who is the founder, who is the CEO, shapes the attitude of the platform, how robust its processes and innovation ecosystem is. There's a lot of discussion around responsible innovation and being a responsible platform, and each platform has its own nuance to it. But true responsibility has a much more detailed, layered understanding of what technology innovation actually means. An easy example. If you want to take down an image on a very popular search engine, maybe it's a deepfake, a nudified deepfake of you as a private professional woman, your word alone is not enough. You can't send that platform a request to take it down and they say, oh, okay, cool, fine, sorry, we'll take it down. They will ask you, can you prove you are who you say you are? Can you get somebody else to vouch for you, to confirm your identity? And then the process will take several months, if not longer. And I have met people who have been fighting this for years just to take down misinformation, disinformation, non-consensual intimate image abuse from these public platforms. Why is it so hard? When a platform is designed by a woman for women, the attitude is different. That means that a woman's word is enough. And at Bumble, that was very central to how trust and safety worked on the platform. If you put in a complaint about abuse you were receiving, whether online or offline, that would be enough. When innovation ecosystems and sprints were being done, it was always with women as the end user. And then you think about safety in a different way. How do we make sure that we are making this a much more conducive, a much happier, much kinder ecosystem? And so there was a big discussion around positive platform design and kindness by design, and what does that mean in combating toxicity and ensuring responsibility? But that's just for a platform. Then there was a broader piece around advocating for making the internet safer for women. What does that actually mean? It meant changing laws in parts of the US, in Texas, and in Virginia, to ban cyber flashing, right? The receipt of essentially dick pics, non-consent, private images that are sent to you if you forget to take your, Bluetooth off, and somebody will flash you digitally on a train, on a bus, and you as a woman will then feel very unsafe. And so part of it is advocating for legal change. The other part of it was making sure that you as a platform are responsible enough to help develop an innovation that prevents that from happening, and then open sourcing that to ensure that other platforms minimize that type of behavior. So that's platform design. The other key part of this is education. Ensuring that there is a real focus on understanding the complexities of what it means to stay safe online. Not just plugging your book, but also the important work that Glitch has been doing in highlighting where there are gaps, in highlighting some of the research in terms of the level of perpetuation of these types of nefarious harms. Similar work was done when I was at Bumble to really understand how prevalent is cyberflashing, how prevalent is non-consensual intimate image abuse, how prevalent is toxicity in AI and misogyny in AI when it comes to women, and what are the impacts on women's mental health, on their offline safety. And it's only when you really understand just how many people, how many women are impacted day in, day out by these issues that you are then motivated to make change. And how are you motivated to make change? By speaking to your representatives, by changing laws. But changing laws is not enough. You need the industry to truly be responsible actors. You need them to take up the baton and put in place, trust and safety councils that actually have teeth, right? Like actually aren't just there to, tick a box and be a PR scheme, but truly are critical and reviewing the terms of service, the internal moderation policies, etc. And to the gaps, it isn't just the US. In sub-Saharan Africa, one of the early work that I did back in 2020 was around the concept of data colonialism, right? It isn't just Scarlett Johansson, it is actually the development of partnerships that are, government to government, based on infrastructure relationships or knowledge exchanges. Oh, but we'll just have our Western or Asian AI company come there and help make your train systems better. But whilst they're helping build and make the train systems better, they'll also collect data on the people who live in Addis Ababa or Nairobi or Kampala. And you consent to that as a government. Without the understanding of the complexities, that then means that you have given away access to the most valuable commodity since 2017 in the world, which is data. The data of your people, how they look, how they sound, the languages they speak, and that then means an entire continent is reduced in its ability to compete effectively in the AI technology innovation space because that uniqueness is now being extrapolated. And so we have to ensure that the power of the Brussels effect is truly amplified globally and particularly in emerging economies. We know that many countries have taken GDPR and basically copied and pasted it for their countries. They will do similar things with the DSA, with the AI Act, but ultimately we need to make sure that it isn't just the outputs of technology that are addressed, it is also the first principles. A lot of time was spent in my previous role here in Brussels, actually speaking to MEPs, to the Commission several years ago about the importance of not just dealing with non-consensual intimate image abuse once the images are out there and asking platforms to take it down, but actually why are we not banning the AI tools that are being developed? Why are platforms not being made to take those down? And we've come far, but we've still got a long way to go when that part of the discussion has been sidelined.
A long way to go. I see you've got your mic up, and I wanted to bring in Asha before and then come back to you, Matale, around this governance, right? Like the governance is meant to be about systemic issues, not the whack-a-mole, not we're going on to this issue and this issue, which is making civil society groups burn out. It's not sustainable. By the time you fundraise the money to do the project, it's another different harm. Is there other lessons that we should be learning from existing AI governance initiatives and case studies?
I think, yes, definitely. I think very clearly, there's been a lot of conversation around the AI Act, I'm sure, over the last few days. But I would reiterate by starting to say it's hard for AI governance to kind of understand and cater to mitigate those harms if they haven't been embedded in the first place. If they haven't taken a human rights-based approach from the first place, it's very hard to embed them later on. And so there needs to be kind of formal structures, and CDT, we advocate for this in not just in the AI Act, but kind of the DSA and other places too, that there needs to be like formal, very publicly accessible, very transparent mechanisms and channels for a diverse group of civil society to engage with the regulators and with platforms to kind of say, okay, we need to be part of this conversation and not just a bit of a tick box exercise later on. Where these forums do exist, you have to make sure that there's a wide representation of organizations. So this actually goes back to what we were talking about before, right? In terms of you may have more traditional digital rights organizations, but of course they're on their own journey in regards to bringing in different perspectives there. Similarly, you may have organizations who just had lack of resources and working on racial or gender justice, but just don't have the capacity to engage in those issues and have to deprioritize, right? So you need to make sure there's a diversity there. I mean, the AI Act itself has this advisory group that's supposed to have civil society engaged, but there's no guidelines to specify how that should be established and who should be chosen and who those other interest groups are. So I look at the AI Act as there's already lessons to be learned, even though it's only just come into force. But the directive also as well. So we've celebrated the directive itself. And I wanted to bring this back to consent too, in terms of those governance initiatives, because it does include things around a victims' rights approach and kind of approaching things from that perspective. But there are also holes in it where you can see that actually it might cause harm unintentionally, right? And so we're talking about deepfakes today, but the directive also talks about cyber harassment, it talks about cyber incitement to hatred, and unfortunately the wording of that directive would capture an incident, for example, of say where Black women communities come together as bystanders to prevent, say, someone from receiving harm, right? So it includes language around the criminalization of initiating an attack with third parties. None of those terms have been defined in the text, right? So a lot of work that Glitch has done, for example, of like standing by, not allowing this to happen, creating a community, a lot of what Black feminist analysts and journalists have been doing online for the last 10 to 15 years may be considered a criminal act if someone wants to go that way. So it's also about what's in the governance structures there that's supposed to be there. So yeah, it's about including those civil society organizations and bringing them in. But the last thing I wanted to say on this is tying it to that question that we've been talking about of humanity, right? Because I can talk very much about the EU context and how in the last few years there's been more of an increasing to bring in more diverse voices. And yes, we recognize that, you know, certain groups are more disproportionately impacted. But I always caution when this happens, because is it once again an exploitation of our trauma in this context? Are we only invited into these spaces to share a sad story, to make you feel bad enough that maybe we should be included in these frameworks in the first place? And that in itself is inherently founded in the question of us having to validate our humanity again, right? So it's, yes, these forums need to exist. Yes, you need to make sure that there is a way for a lot of diverse organizations to participate, those representing communities who suffer intersectional harms, but it must be done in a manner of respect and recognition of why they weren't there in the first place. And so as we look at these different frameworks, the AI Act, the DSA, the directive, the Online Safety Act, for example, it's a let's not have a meeting 2 days before we adopt some guidelines because we forgot to invite this group and we want to make sure that we can say in our PR that we invited them and they gave us a consultation. But I want to end on a maybe happier note. I don't know, maybe it's useful. Just to say that we're still early days, right? These laws have just been finalized and adopted, but there's a lot of guidelines to come. There's a lot of secondary legislation to come. A lot of these frameworks are principle-based, definitely for the DSA and definitely for the directive, where member states can do better. Member states can do better. They need to remember that when it comes to a directive. But the opportunity to improve, to correct those mistakes, to correct the fact that Black women's voices have been devoid of that policy making in the first place can still be rectified. So yeah, the opportunity is still there. I'm going to be optimistic for the last sentence.
I think it's important that when we're providing this critique, we're not saying it's all doomsday. We're providing this to critique because we are joyful users of the internet. Like the memes that me and Matale share on Instagram, like me and Asher in a Black Women Resting WhatsApp group. Like we are lovers of this internet. Our critique is not from a place of hatred. It's from a place of we want better and we want to stop being excluded and the practices not being exploitative, right? We don't want to keep repeating colonial practices. Matala, I could see earlier you were really eager to come in. What were your additional thoughts?
First of all, +1 everything, but to answer that question on my initial thought and kind of going back to this idea that we're joyful users of the internet. We are AI for the people. We are not ban AI, stop using AI. We love it. We think used appropriately, there is a lot of potential. But one of the things that I will say, coming from a low-touch regulation environment, is that we also don't need to take down everything. I think often we get into these spaces and it's like, companies should take down, companies should take down. AI for the people, and personally, even in my own kind of online investigation work, I think we really do need to remember what René de Nester at Stanford offered us, which is freedom of speech does not mean freedom of reach. And I know that you and I, certainly on the TikTok Advisory Council, we have always said there are alternatives for toxic speech. If we're not going to completely take down, we can make sure that it doesn't rise to the front page. We can make sure that there are screens. We can make sure, and we can make sure that there are inter-platform communication so that toxic speech from one place or toxic images from one place don't end up in another place. And I think that idea of being an imaginative technologist and a problem-solving technologist who is still rights respecting, who still believes in the freedom of expression, and who still does not think there should be a toxicity on the internet should be expressed and should be there. And one of the things that I struggle with, even though I do love regulation, is the very kind of principle-based approach to regulation, and encouraging more technologists to get into the conversation who are also thinking tactically. So if we're thinking about impact assessment, for example, as a way of making sure that we have the data to prove that this group are being contacted, we also have to think about what does it mean from a VC perspective. So not even the CEO of the company, who are the money, who are the private offices, who are the VCs that are funding, and how do we incentivize and encourage them to give startups the time that they need to innovate in ways that are kind and ways that are responsible, right? So changing innovation culture. And then I think the other thing about that is that we take it above the CEO, because the CEO is going to respond to whoever gave them the money. So really understanding who's on that cap table. Also, as we think about internet, women, protecting women, having a business case to find out who actually does use the internet, who's going to buy your product, who's going to consume your product, and this kind of gets to the point about sub-Saharan Africa and other emerging economies. They should be leading what our principles are, because they are the users. That's where the young people are. Having a conversation with my mother about the Kendrick Lamar and Drake beef is a completely different thing than having that same conversation with my teenage children who are connected and online, right? That's a very small example, but we're all in the WhatsApp group together. So we have to understand where is the youth culture, who are the users, and how can we protect our future audiences rather than it's a good thing to protect Black women. And then lastly, when we were first interacting with the UN, we were really interfacing with the African, it was a forum for people of African descent. We found out that they had like 1 staff member and $3. And then we ended up going to the UN Business and Technology Project and being able to influence their processes, and we found out not only were they in San Francisco, so we had to go to meetings there, but they had all the major tech companies, and they had budgets. So when we're thinking about these spaces, we also have to talk about the funding of these spaces, and I do think trust and safety councils by tech companies are a really good model that civil society could follow, but they're also funded to do this work. So it shouldn't just be a bunch of do-gooders that come together. We actually need deep investment in this work also.
We do need deep investment. I mean, we need to keep talking about money here because it's an unfair fight, right? It's, you know, multi-billion-pound companies with offshore accounts and all sorts of stuff that is probably a Netflix series to come. We need money, and we need money to do this work. And the fundamental thing that I think Black feminist practices offer is that you need to remunerate for labor. free labor is slavery. And if we're going to be talking about equitable practices, we need to stop asking people to do things for free. We need to stop asking for pick your brain coffees and for advice. And, you know, the new trend that irritates me, she's closing her notebook. The new trend that irritates me is using citation as a way of copying work and making lots and lots of money from black feminist text, black feminist authorship, but not actually making sure that they are the ones that are being paid. And I think this is an important time to bring up Shafika Hudson, right, who died in February this year, and she was one of the main organizers around Your Slip is Showing, right, the End Father's Day campaign or fake campaign that Asha was talking about. Shafika Hudson died age 46 in a motel room this year. She's the reason why, up until Elon Musk, we had a safer Twitter experience. She's the reason why Black Twitter was able to keep being its amazing space and provide lots of profit for tech companies. And she died on her own, having to crowdsource for her medical bills to be paid. This is a fundamental issue in practice that actually our civil society groups replicate in the name of, we're a non-for-profit and we don't have the budget. No, you haven't planned your budget well, so to remunerate the expertise. She opens her notebooks again. We've got about 10 more minutes, if I'm right, Josh, before questions. And I thought it might be helpful to summarize what I've heard so that we can make sure the last 10 minutes is full of the things that you want to leave with the audience and provoke and make them feel even more uncomfortable. What I've heard is that Black feminist analysis and organizing is fundamental to thinking about governance, which is about understanding that intersectionality is a legal framework and that it's effective and that you save money by focusing on the most marginalized, the most minoritized. You are going to make the online space safer. You're going to make your tech tools safer. You're going to make your data sets more representative. But if you keep only focusing the media stories on your Taylor Swifts and only on folks on the global north, you're forgetting the richness in the global south and other groups that don't get a mention. The second thing that I've heard so far in the conversation is about the types of questions that we're asking to change the power dynamics. So the question is not about, oh, what do we need to do to get more Black women into the room, but what are the practices, frameworks, ideologies, values that your organizations or your research projects hold that are systemically excluding Black women from being in the room or in the conversation. Then we had a very cool conversation around consent and then the need to rehumanize ourselves as people online and offline, so able to respect data, we're able to respect the collection and mining of data, and maybe even radically moving on to the R word. The R word that led to Glitch's existence that I'm going to bring up today, reparations. What about thinking about a governance structure that is about repairing harm and exploitative practices done before? It's not saying, okay, we're going to draw the slate clean from June 2024, but thinking about how technology has evolved and become innovative now has been on the back of exploitative practices. So we need to be thinking about redress. And then very finally, what I'm hearing from you, obviously amazing people because I know of you, but just hearing more about your work, is that in AI governance, we need to be thinking about the different roads and career paths technologists and activists may be coming from, legal backgrounds, community organizing backgrounds, not just your academia, not just your civil servants, but really thinking about who's not in the room from a class and professional perspective. That's what I feel like we are up to. So the kind of final kind of question to ask the panel is, are there additional accountability mechanisms that we can use to prevent harm and to redress the grievances faced by Black women and other marginalized groups? Nima.
That's a really big question. And honestly, I think a few things are more empowering in our society than legal structures, legal frameworks. And I think I can't help but go back to some of the research I did in my previous role at the World Economic Forum, where we found that in Europe, maybe 90% plus countries had GDPR and digital laws in place, and then you contrast that to a part of the world like sub-Saharan Africa, where only about 40% of African countries had a governance structure in place, and we're talking about data protection, we're not even talking about AI governance, that can actually empower the individual so that their images, their IP, their innovations are not copyrighted. There's a big question mark around enforceability of some of these issues, right? It's not just about having those laws in place, but and we haven't really evolved as much in the last 4 years. And so I do think there is a really important piece about having an honest conversation about ensuring that there is an even playing field when it comes to the regulation of technologies globally, and that it isn't, if you happen to be European or living in Europe, you're really well protected, your privacy is really well protected, you can bring lawsuits. But if you are in another part of the world, it is open season and you have no recourse to the digital abuses that you're experiencing. There's a big piece around education and digital skills, right? To your point earlier about, there's a huge young population in emerging economies, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where I think something as high as like 70% are under 40 in terms of the population on the continent. And that is such a huge number of people who are either already online or about to come online, and navigating a digital space when you have no idea about issues around privacy and safety and how to leverage the power of technology for the benefit of you and your immediate family and society. These are just basic things that really require a lean in by industry, and not just the tech industry across the board, to think about how they are empowering and upskilling their workers, whether they are based in London or they're based in Delhi or they're based in Kampala. The last thing I will say is really about the importance of data-driven research. There's a lot of conversation that happens about the peripheries of, we're here talking about deepfakes and synthetic media, and how that impacts Black women, but there is very, very little research actually being done that is credible to actually then inform trust and safety councils, platforms, think about, actually, this is a real problem. How do we address it? How do we think differently about it? And not every platform will do their own research, will dig deep in this. This is where civil society is crucial for keeping us honest and ensuring that they are really nailing down where are the gaps, where are the true gaps, and what are some of the solutions. But sometimes just critical thinking is, where are the gaps? We don't have to find the solutions, right? And so that is really important, because that's actually how a lot of the work that I was doing when I was at Bumble stemmed from. Just understanding how prevalent non-consensual intimate image abuse and cyberphishing was triggered Whitney, our founder of Bumble, to want to lean in and do something about it, not just on the platform, but off the platform as well and across the industry. And that is why it's super important to make sure, institutions like Glitch exist, and CDT, but also are well-funded and independent. Amen. Right? And independent, because I think that is what makes it a much more credible exchange when they are looking and working with platforms. But thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I have so much more to say, but let me stop there.
Thank you. I mean, we're going to go to questions, so there'll be definitely more to say. But when you talked about being well-funded, I had to say amen. Not just because it's a full moon in Sagittarius, and so the spirits are listening, but because I think people forget, right? They forget that this stuff requires, like, for all of you guys to be here, it's arranging childcare, it's arranging things, to be here. It's money, right? Like, it costs, and it's really easy for us to do this kind of panel on a shoestring, and that kind of scarcity mindset. But I was very clear with the team, we are going to do this with a place of abundance. We're going to be rested so that we can have our talents held in rest and abundance, rather than being fried and then, doing work emails. Like, no. And we have a team we're remote, but we have a team in the virtual office who are holding the fort so that we can stay here. And I think the organizing of how we do this is just as important about what we do. But Matale, I could see you nodding along here. Please, what else can we do to strengthen accountability mechanisms?
Amen. I am definitely going to start with research and then go in a slightly different direction. But one of the things that I've learned, certainly in the 8 years that I've been looking at this, but in the 4 years at AI for the People, is that we do need to get specific research funded on the gaps. So one of the things that I'm looking to do in my personal journey, but it's really for the organization as well, is I'm starting a PhD program at Cambridge. Thank you. And I'm looking at digital humanities, and that's because I want to be able to do independent online investigations into some of the issues that we've raised. And through that process, I had to basically pitch the university for funding for why my research was valuable. And I did get the funding, but it did also point out to me that from a foundational perspective, I'm really interested in democracy. That's my question. We can speak about it afterwards. I'm not going to bore you with it here. But the idea that there are other people that are applying to do the same type of work that I do, but may not get the funding from it, does lead to this deficit. And when I went to our first conference, Shay luckily showed up, but Shay and I were the only black women. And so not only were we the only black women, we were also the only black people. So we were representing everybody in the world who agrees with us. Maybe not. So there's that part, but I'm also thinking about the ways in which the issues that we're speaking about here, which are very specifically deepfakes and black women, impact other movements, and specifically the environmental justice movement. I am not sure if any of you have, but I have because I am a nerd, as I've just let you all know. I was looking at the Microsoft annual report and how their water bill had something like quadrupled because of the amount of water that it takes to cool data processing centers for Gen AI, and thinking about the way that these new environmental questions are going to be raised through the development of large language models, and how those issues are actually the same as people like Mia Mosby, I think I've got her name wrong, but from Barbados, who has been thinking about climate activism on the multinational stage as being a racial and reparative issue, and thinking about if we can somehow now do this kind of cross-sector education that takes us into the global majority, because guess what? We need cobalt that's coming from Central Republic of Africa, which is also fueling civil war. I know that this is not a panel about peace. There are other conflicts, including those in the Middle East right now and in Gaza, where a lot of this image technology is being perfected in the theater of war. Is that ethical? Should that be done? Are there other movements that we could be speaking about? And then on the academic front, people like me who are kind of entering academia because nobody is answering the questions in the books that I'm reading, with the exception of you, Shay, making that show up in the peer review process. So it's not just me being really passionate about this, but we are going through the peer review process and then getting into the best journals in the Western world. They don't even look at African journals, for example, as being seats of knowledge production, which is not just racist, but it's ridiculous. And so thinking about how are the other ways that we're fixing these very fundamental systems, particularly because I'm somebody who lives in the African diaspora. So Africa isn't this faraway place. I was actually born in Zambia. I can take you to the hospital I was born in, but have grown up in these other spaces and still have to do that carrying also.
I wanted to write down what you said, but I was like, where do I write it down? But you're right. We can't talk about strengthening accountability mechanisms if we're not willing to have the uncomfortable conversations around conflict and around genocide. Like, we cannot do that. And intersectionality is a framework to do that, which if you find it uncomfortable, I'm sorry, you're going to be hit with a ton of bricks. Intersectionality is providing that challenge, and we can't sit here and talk about accountability mechanisms without addressing the fact that the tools and phones we're using come from offline exploitative practices and then are perfected in the most terrible acts that human beings can make. Which leaves me with asking you, Asha, the final thoughts around what else can strengthen accountability mechanisms, and what can generative AI look like in the future for Black women?
So I will come back to your point on the intersectional methodology, because it's a natural methodology. You can use and apply it. It's been done. But I'll be concrete in a couple of things. Let's take the AI Act again, for example. There's an opportunity to issue guidelines to the national level regulators in terms of how they undertake assessments when it comes to the reporting of harms, right? So we can encourage them to make sure that they're identifying those kind of discriminatory effects and trends and doing it in a concrete way so that they can see precisely what's happening. There are formal mechanisms enabling the European Commission, for example, to continuously receive reports from civil society about quote-unquote AI harms. And so, again, we can feed into this. There's analysis of existing EU equality law. There's analysis of existing mechanisms for redress. There are very concrete opportunities in which we can advocate and hold the regulators and those who have to abide by those obligations to account for increasing their accountability. Because we can't forget that under the international human rights framework, these platforms, but also governments, have an obligation to make sure businesses and services are not infringing on our rights and that they uphold our rights enshrined in law. And if we're talking about us all being in humanity, then that is covered too. But I did want to come back to your point on intersectionality and come back to the point on research, right? Because there is extensive literature out there already in terms of how you can do this approach, how you can conduct a human rights impact assessment from an intersectional approach, right? How you can make sure a government is doing that. And I wanted to give two concrete examples. So we've talked about kind of risk assessments, and you can gender mainstream a risk assessment, right? The city of Vienna has in its constitution that its budget needs to be gender mainstreamed. So we have actual government bodies, and it's also part of under the EU treaties, Article 2. It's in the papers in terms of ensuring the rights are there and that this is taken into consideration for all legislation that's developed in the EU, right? So there are accountability mechanisms for the lawmakers themselves in order to put that in place to say, no, you have an actual obligation to do this, and you can use an intersectional methodology. And I highly encourage you to actually read Kimberly Crenshaw's work for the woman who coined the term intersectional. It's not just a buzzword. It was developed out of somewhere, and how to assess risk and impact. And the last example I will give to you on how to do that is we work on the Digital Services Act, and as you've mentioned, each of us have done a lot of work looking at this from an intersectional perspective. And I think many of you who are familiar with the Digital Services Act knows that there's the risk assessment provision. So Article 34, there are systemic risks that you need to address and platforms have to assess. Now, gender disinformation is a really good example of how all four of those systemic risks intersect with one another, right? Because gender disinformation, if you think about it, is one of those risks where it could be a risk to electoral participation.
Correct.
And freedom of access to information, and for women politicians to feel engaged. It's a risk of online GBV because it often extends into that measure too. It's a risk on mental health of the women politicians who are engaged on it. It's an infringement of their fundamental rights. It's an infringement of access to information, as I've mentioned. It cuts across all of the systemic risks.
Access to money, right? The cost, right? When Lizzo says like she can't take this abuse anymore,
yeah.
She's off. That's impacting her money. It has a financial impact too.
It has such a massive impact, right? And we know that this is leading to, say, young women not wanting to engage in the political scene because they're thinking, I don't want to have to engage in this anymore. So you have a requirement for very large online platforms to assess those risks on their services. I would argue that gender disinformation as even an issue, or how deepfakes comes into this, let's say, requires them to do those assessments with an intersectional methodology. Without doing that, they won't be able to assess properly how bad gender disinformation is being disseminated, and where the root causes are coming from and how it's being proliferated. So I think there's multiple ways that we can hold them to account, and there are there's a lot of research that goes into this, and I would be remiss if I didn't flag that Glitch has done some amazing research on this. Please visit their website. I throw it back to you, Shei, actually, to maybe even just talk a little bit more about that research too.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually, maybe we can put the QR code on the screen where you guys can find out a little bit more about Glitch and our research. But the latest research that we've done is something called the Digital Misogynoir Report, which was looking at how language models could be improved from an anti-blackness lens, so that it was picking up the usual tropes and stereotypes that black women face offline, but now are being shared online. I'm conscious that we've got a question and answer session now, but I would highly recommend you having a look at that, because the fundamental issues that we do have in AI is the data sets in itself. So we're moving on to Q&A. Josh, are you ready? And remember, it's questions and answers, and position statements and all of that stuff is for online social media only. Questions? Hands? I see a man at the back, but I just want to double check before we go to the man, Josh. Is there any women who would like to speak first? Okay, the room has granted you permission.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah, sorry, I'm a man. I can't help it. Thank you very much for the inspirational panel. I was wondering, you were talking about accountability mechanisms and talked a lot about regulation and civil society and how you can use those tools to increase accountability. And I was wondering if you see a role for civil or constitutional courts as well, as a mechanism to increase accountability, as we've, for example, seen in climate litigation or other rights movements.
Thank you. And what was your name?
My name is Douwe.
Where are you from, Douwe?
The Netherlands.
Netherlands, hi. Yeah. I was going to try and say hi in Dutch, and I don't know. Nima, would you like to take that question first?
Sure, happy to jump in. So I think coming from a common law jurisdiction, one of the most powerful things is the ability for courts to interpret much more broadly, and in some other examples in other parts of the world, much more narrowly, legislation. And that has a profound impact in our societies, both good and bad. And so, yes, I'm biased as the former lawyer on the panel. I do think there is a lot the judiciary can do in making sure that where policymakers have maybe fallen short in providing these protections, i.e., will there potentially be litigation in relation to the AI Act, for example, to talk about the development of nefarious AI as being part and parcel, even though that may not be captured within the language of the statute itself. Similarly, in the UK's Online Safety Act, there is a big discussion around the lack of reference to gender and violence against women and girls as a dedicated protections there. Is that an opportunity for the courts to actually infer, as they are able to do, particularly in common law jurisdictions, that these are protections because they are fundamental human rights protections, and therefore that is another way of providing a more robust protections for society. I may look at you for the other side of the Atlantic.
So yes and yes. Just to kind of back up what Asha was saying, I can certainly say from a US perspective, when we think about civil rights legislation, Brown v. Brown Brown v. Brown Board of Education was impact litigation that was brought by black lawyers to really highlight how the equal protection clause in the Constitution was not being fulfilled and was ultimately successful. Unfortunately, and that was a Supreme Court that was, in my opinion, much better than the crowd of characters that we now have, because Google v. Gonzalez, which went before the court last year, was looking at this very specific case where a family were a family were basically alleging that YouTube's hosting of ISIS video had created this political environment which led to the terrorist attack in Paris. And one of the court ruled for Google because they couldn't prove it was a particular video. And one of the things that two of the justices said was, well, we don't really understand the internet, so whatever, which wasn't helpful. But where it was helpful was that we are now seeing these challenges rise. And as we see these challenges rise, that there are these what I consider to be extremely brave lawyers who are going in through the lower courts to bring this through. And I think that we'll ultimately be successful. So yeah, legal processes, badass lawyers, dope people, do your thing.
I'm going to ask Asha to come in, but just want to double check if there was one final question in the audience. Yes, one final question. So Josh, we'll come over to you. Asha?
Sure. No, I'll be quick and just to kind of add on to what's been said. I think in the EU context, we know how useful strategic litigation has been when it comes to tech and data protection and those kind of policies. So I don't think we're going to be devoid of that with this kind of new generation of legislation that we have. The DSA, the AI Act, there are things in there that just couldn't be addressed because negotiators needed to finish the text and get it passed before they could answer those questions. And so I think they even knew, as legislators themselves, we'll let the courts tell us what this means precisely. And that's very evident, I think, as you read through some of those texts. So I don't think we can be devoid of that at all. I think the interpretation of the courts on some of those legislations is going to be so vital. And I think, again, it's going to be the work of, say, the civil society organizations who are doing the researchers and the lawyers who are taking these questions and are going to have to force these answers. That's going to be so crucial. So I think we'll be looking at this again
and
probably
quickly,
in a few
international jurisdiction,
yes,
too. Who's responsible where, what, and when?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I think I'm going to end there so that we don't unpack a question, that we cannot finish, but that doesn't mean that we cannot talk after coffee and continue the conversation on LinkedIn and on social media. I think I'll end by saying that conversations on governance is incomplete if you don't have Black women in the room. That not only is it racist, it's ineffective, and it's just plain silly is what I think I was getting from Matale. And what I've heard from Nima is that we need to unlearn our biases and the pathways that people may go through to or be on to get to the space. It might not be the conventional ways, particularly with folks in the global south, if we want to have a truly robust AI governance systems. And that the provocation for you all, as we're at time, is what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do to make sure that governance and AI conversations are more equitable and more fair, and actually more joyful, because this was a lot of fun. Thank you very, very much, Matale, Nima, and Asha.